The officer didn't rush the stop. He didn't need to. The red and blue lights flashed once, then twice, then stayed on. The man behind the wheel slowed down immediately, signaling, pulling over with careful precision. No sudden movements, no hesitation, just calm. The kind of calm that doesn't try to prove anything. Traffic moved past them, unaware that this ordinary roadside moment was about to turn unforgettable. The officer stepped out of his patrol car and adjusted his belt. One glance at the driver was all it took for him to make up his mind. Not because the man looked dangerous, not because he looked important, but because he looked ordinary. Simple jacket, neutral expression, hands resting clearly on the steering wheel. Nothing about him matched the officer's expectation of authority, status, or urgency. License and registration. The officer said, his tone firm but casual. The man complied without a word. As the officer looked over the documents, something shifted. His posture straightened. His voice hardened just slightly. Enough for the cameras. Enough for the people driving by to notice. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer said. The request wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The door opened slowly. The man stepped out, keeping his movements deliberate and visible. He stood beside the car, relaxed but attentive, eyes steady, shoulders loose. No questions, no resistance. Just silence. A passing driver slowed down to watch. Another turned their head. Something about the stillness felt heavier than a confrontation ever could. The officer circled him once, then stopped. "You know why I pulled you over?" he asked. The man shook his head calmly. The officer exhaled through his nose as if already annoyed. A small comment followed, dismissive, unnecessary. Not loud, but clear enough. It was the kind of remark people make when they believe they're in complete control. The man didn't respond. That's when the silence changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was intentional. The officer shifted his weight, waiting for an explanation. Waiting for defensiveness. Waiting for something, anything that would confirm his assumption. But none came. The man simply stood there, calm, composed, almost patient, as if he understood something the officer didn't. A breeze passed. The sound of traffic filled the gap. Seconds stretched longer than they should have. Engagement. Have you ever watched a moment where nothing seemed wrong, but you could feel that something was about to change? The officer cleared his throat. Another glance at the documents, another look at the man's face. Still nothing, no fear, no ego, no explanation. Just a quiet presence that made the situation feel suddenly unbalanced. And in that moment, before names were spoken, before anyone realized who they were standing in front of, the officer made a decision. A small one, the wrong one. And the silence that followed would soon tell everyone exactly why. Have you ever seen a moment where everything felt normal, and then suddenly wasn't? From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a routine traffic stop. Two vehicles on the shoulder, an officer standing upright, a driver waiting calmly beside his car. Scenes like this happen thousands of times every day. Most ended in minutes, documents checked, a warning issued, everyone moving on. No one slowed down for long, no one remembered them afterward. But this one felt different, not because of shouting, not because of danger, because of contrast. The man stood quietly, hands relaxed at his sides, posture balanced. He wasn't trying to look confident. He wasn't trying to look harmless either. He simply was what he was, present, steady, unbothered by the tension that seemed to be building around him. The officer, on the other hand, had already decided who he was dealing with. Experience teaches officers to read situations quickly. Clothing, body language, vehicle condition, tone of voice. Those details often guide how a stop unfolds, but assumptions can quietly take over. The jacket wasn't expensive. The car wasn't flashy. There was no visible sign of influence or status. To the officer, this wasn't someone important. This was someone manageable. That belief shaped everything that followed. He asked another question, this time slower, more deliberate, designed less to gather information and more to assert control. The kind of question that expected a reaction. Still, the man didn't interrupt, didn't push back, didn't offer explanations that hadn't been requested. He listened. That alone unsettled the rhythm of the stop. Most people talk when they're nervous, they over-explain. They try to fill silence with words, hoping to soften authority. Some get defensive. Some get angry. Some crack jokes they regret immediately. This man did none of it. He waited. The officer stepped back toward his patrol car, radio in hand, eyes still on the driver. As he spoke quietly into the mic, passing vehicles rolled by, their drivers glancing over with mild curiosity before looking away again. To them, this was just another roadside moment. But inside the interaction, pressure was building. The officer glanced again at the documents. Nothing obvious stood out, no red flags, no reason for escalation. And yet his tone didn't soften. Instead, it hardened. Sometimes authority expects submission, and when it doesn't get it, even silent submission, it searches for dominance in other ways. The officer returned, standing a little closer than necessary. "Where are you headed today?" he asked. It wasn't the question that mattered. It was the way it was asked. The man answered calmly, briefly, respectfully, no attitude, no edge. The answer didn't satisfy the officer. Not because it was suspicious, but because it didn't give him leverage. Another pause followed, this time longer. The man's calm wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It didn't demand attention. But it was undeniable, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance of the moment began to shift. A second patrol car drove past without stopping. The officer noticed. His jaw tightened slightly. He was used to controlling the flow of interactions, used to people reacting the way he expected them to. But this man wasn't playing any role. He wasn't acting important. He wasn't acting afraid. He was simply present. That presence made the silence heavier. The officer cleared his throat again and made a comment, half under his breath, half intentional. Not aggressive enough to be called out, not quiet enough to be private, a remark rooted in assumption. The kind that reveals more about the speaker than the listener. Still, the man said nothing. He didn't flinch, didn't correct him, didn't even shift his stance. That's when the officer realized something was off. Not wrong, just off. People who have nothing usually try to convince you of something. People who are afraid usually show it. But people who are certain don't rush. The officer glanced once more at the documents, then at the man's face. Really looked this time. The eyes weren't nervous. They weren't defiant either. They were calm, measuring, patient, as if the man understood how these moments unfold, as if he'd seen authority misread situations before. Traffic noise continued. A breeze moved dust across the pavement. The world didn't stop, but the moment felt suspended. At this point, do you think the officer should have paused or pushed harder? Let me know what you think. The officer straightened his shoulders. He was still in control. At least that's what he believed. But something had already shifted. Not because of power, not because of status. Because silence, when carried with confidence, has a way of exposing assumptions. And the officer hadn't realized it yet. But he was standing in front of a man who didn't need to explain himself. Not now. Not yet. The officer's patience began to thin, not outwardly, not in any way that would raise alarms, but just enough to be felt. He took a half step closer. Not aggressively, not casually either. It was the kind of movement meant to remind someone who controlled the space. "Stand right there," the officer said. The man complied without hesitation, stopping exactly where he was told. His posture remained relaxed, almost neutral, as if this was simply another moment passing in the day. That calm should have ended the tension. Instead, it made it worse. Because when authority expects friction and gets none, it often mistakes silence for defiance. The officer asked another question. Then another. Each one slightly less necessary than the last. Each one less about information and more about pressure. The answers were short, clear, respectful, no edge, no challenge. Still, something in the officer's expression suggested he wasn't satisfied. He glanced toward the road, then back at the man. A small pause followed, just long enough for discomfort to settle in. "You seem awfully relaxed," the officer said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a test. The man looked at him calmly. "I'm just answering your questions, officer." His voice was steady, even, not defensive. That response, measured and controlled, should have de-escalated everything. But instead, the officer misread it. He mistook composure for attitude. The tone shifted again, just slightly sharper than before, the kind of shift that people feel more than hear. A comment followed, unnecessary, personal, not shouted, not recorded as aggression, but unmistakably disrespectful. A few drivers passing by slowed down, sensing the tension. One car lingered longer than usual before pulling away. The officer didn't notice or didn't care. He was locked into the moment now. The man remained still. No tightening of the jaw, no clenching of fists, no raised voice. Just silence. And that silence stretched. The officer expected something. An apology, an explanation, a reaction. Something to confirm that his read of the situation was correct. But the man gave him nothing. That's when the officer made the mistake. He stepped back and spoke louder than before, not to the man, but to the space around them. A statement meant to assert control, meant to remind everyone watching who had authority. It was the wrong move. not because it crossed a line, but because it revealed one. The man turned his head slightly, acknowledging the words, then returned his gaze forward, calm, grounded, unmoved. The contrast was impossible to ignore now. One person trying to dominate the moment, the other letting it unfold. The officer's confidence wavered, just for a second. He checked the documents again, then again. Nothing changed, and that uncertainty did something dangerous. It pushed him forward. "Stay here," the officer said sharply, walking back toward the patrol car. His radio crackled to life, low voices. Static. The man stood exactly where he was told. Traffic continued. The world kept moving. But the air felt heavier now. Minutes passed. The officer returned, posture stiff, eyes searching the man's face for something he still hadn't found. "You understand why I'm being thorough," he said. It wasn't a question. The man nodded once. "I do." That was it. No complaint, no sarcasm, no challenge. Just acknowledgement. The officer didn't like that answer. It didn't give him control. It didn't give him leverage. So he leaned in slightly and made another remark, quiet, pointed, rooted in assumption. The kind of comment that says, "I've already decided who you are." A few steps away, another driver rolled down their window, slightly watching. The moment was drawing attention now. The man finally spoke again, but only one sentence. Calm, controlled. "I'm cooperating." That was all. No more, no less. And in that moment, the officer realized something, but not fully. He realized he wasn't getting the reaction he expected. What he didn't realize yet was why. The silence wasn't submission. It wasn't fear. It was confidence that didn't need to prove itself. And as the officer stood there, pushing the situation just a little further than necessary, he still believed he was in control. He believed he was reading the situation correctly. He believed this was just another stop. But everyone watching, drivers, bystanders, even the air itself, could feel it now. This wasn't routine anymore. This was the moment where a small assumption turns into a big mistake. And the officer had already made it. "Do you think respect should depend on appearances?" Comment lie yes or no. Silence settled between them, not the empty kind, but the kind that carries weight. The man stood exactly where he had been told, feet planted evenly, shoulders relaxed. His breathing was slow and steady, almost rhythmic, as if he were standing in line somewhere, rather than on the side of a busy road under scrutiny. Nothing about him suggested tension. That alone began to work against the officer. Most people, when questioned this long, start to show cracks. Their voices change. Their hands fidget. Their eyes dart toward the road, the patrol car, the clock in their head counting how much time is being taken from their day. This man showed none of that. He wasn't rushing the moment. He wasn't resisting it either. He was allowing it. The officer watched him closely now, searching for signs, any sign, that his authority was being felt. But the calm in front of him didn't bend. It didn't stiffen. It simply existed. And that kind of calm has a strange effect. It makes impatience louder. It makes insecurity visible. The officer cleared his throat again, adjusting his stance. He asked another procedural question, his voice firm but noticeably less certain than before. The man answered politely, short, clear, done, no extra words. The officer waited for more. Nothing came. A gust of wind pushed dust across the asphalt. Somewhere behind them a horn honked. The world kept moving, but inside the moment, time felt stretched thin. This was no longer about the stop. It was about control. And control, when it isn't challenged, sometimes starts to question itself. The officer shifted his weight again, hands resting near his belt. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't calm either. He was hovering in between, trying to reclaim something that felt like it was slipping without a single word being spoken. The man met his eyes briefly. Not with defiance, not with apology, just acknowledgement. That look lasted barely a second, but it said enough. It said, "I'm here, I'm listening, and I'm not afraid of this moment." The officer looked away first. That detail didn't go unnoticed by the few people who had slowed down to watch. A woman in a passing car glanced back longer than necessary. A truck rolled by slowly, the driver's eyes fixed on the scene. Something about the stillness drew attention. Stillness often does. The officer spoke again, this time more formally, more structured. The kind of tone used to regain ground. The man nodded once. Again, no resistance. The officer paused. It became clear now that raising his voice wouldn't help. Neither would pressing harder without cause. The calm presence in front of him wasn't inviting a mistake, but it wasn't preventing one either. It was simply waiting, and that waiting was powerful. People who are uncertain rush, people who are threatened overcompensate, but people who are sure wait. The officer glanced at the road. then back at the man. His jaw tightened slightly. He took a breath, steadying himself. For the first time since the stop began, he seemed unsure of what the next step should be. That uncertainty hung in the air. The man noticed it, but didn't react. He had seen this before. Not this exact road, not this exact officer, but this moment, the point where authority realizes it may have misjudged the situation. That realization never arrives loudly. It arrives quietly, with a pause, with a shift, with silence. The officer stepped back half a step, creating space without acknowledging it. His eyes flicked to the documents again, as if hoping they would now say something different. They didn't. The calm stood unchanged. The officer exhaled slowly. He wasn't angry now, he wasn't confident either. He was cautious. That change mattered. Because caution doesn't come from power, it comes from doubt. And doubt had entered the moment without a single argument, a single raised voice, or a single threat, just silence. The man remained still, patient, grounded. He wasn't performing calmness. He wasn't forcing it. It was simply who he was. And as the officer stood there, trying to recalibrate, one truth became unavoidable. This man did not feel small in this moment. And people who don't feel small are never as powerless as they appear. The shift didn't happen all at once. It began subtly, so subtly that the officer himself might not have noticed it if he hadn't felt it. Movement slowed. Cars passing by no longer glanced for a second and moved on. Drivers lingered. Heads turned. A few vehicles eased their speed, curiosity pulling their attention back to the scene on the shoulder. Something about the moment had changed. The officer sensed it too. He wasn't alone anymore, not truly. Eyes were on him now. Not judging yet, just watching, waiting. The man remained still beside his car, exactly where he had been for several minutes. His posture hadn't shifted. His expression hadn't changed. If anything, he seemed more settled than before, as if the longer the silence lasted, the more grounded he became. The officer took a step toward the patrol car, then stopped. He looked around briefly, scanning the road, the mirrors, the faces peering from behind windshields. Witnesses. That awareness tightened his shoulders. Authority behaves differently when it knows it's being observed. A second patrol car slowed as it approached, then pulled in behind the first. The sound of tires crunching against gravel broke the quiet. The presence alone altered the atmosphere. The second officer stepped out, surveying the scene with fresh eyes. He took in the driver, the posture, the stillness, the lack of agitation. He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he watched. That silence, now shared, added weight. The first officer spoke quietly to him out of earshot. A few words, a gesture toward the documents, a glance back at the man. The second officer nodded once but didn't immediately react. He looked again, longer this time. The man acknowledged him with a brief, polite nod, nothing more. No attempt to explain. No effort to appeal. That calm didn't read as arrogance. It read as certainty. The second officer's expression shifted just slightly. Not alarm. Not recognition, curiosity. And curiosity changes everything. Another vehicle passed slowly. A driver rolled down their window halfway, pretending to adjust something, clearly watching. The first officer noticed and lowered his voice further. His tone wasn't sharp now. It was measured, controlled, but not confident. The man listened without interruption, eyes steady, hands still visible, body language open and non-threatening. He had given no reason for concern, yet the situation felt heavier than it should have. The second officer stepped closer, glancing at the license again. He frowned not in suspicion, but in concentration. Then he checked it once more. The first officer noticed. A quiet tension formed between them, not conflict, but awareness. The kind that happens when someone begins to question an earlier assumption. Time stretched. The road noise felt distant now, like background static. The moment had narrowed its focus, pulling everyone nearby into its orbit. A third patrol car approached but didn't stop. It slowed, then continued on. Even that small detail added to the pressure. Why slow down if nothing was happening? The man stood patiently through it all. He didn't shift his weight, didn't sigh, didn't glance at his watch. He seemed unconcerned with how long this was taking. And that unsettled everyone. Because people who feel trapped show it. People who feel rushed show it. But people who know something others don't wait. The first officer cleared his throat again, louder than before, as if reminding himself of his role. He spoke briefly, procedural, almost rehearsed. The man nodded again. Still nothing more. The second officer looked at him one more time, then back at the first. Their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them. Not panic, recognition of uncertainty. The first officer adjusted his stance, subtly squaring his shoulders, reclaiming composure. But the edge was gone. The dominance he'd carried earlier had softened into something else. Caution. Nearby, a woman in a sedan raised her phone, not obviously recording, but holding it in a way that suggested she might be. The first officer noticed. His posture changed instantly. He straightened. His voice lowered. His words became careful. The man noticed too, but didn't react. He had nothing to hide, and nothing to prove. The tension wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was thick. It was the kind that settles in when everyone realizes this moment matters, but no one is sure why yet. And as the officers stood there, aware now of eyes, of witnesses, of time passing longer than it should, the man remained exactly the same, calm, grounded, unmoved. Because the silence hadn't weakened him, it had revealed him. And the people watching were beginning to understand. This wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. It was about what happens when assumptions are made, in front of witnesses, and time gives them nowhere to hide. The moment didn't explode. It collapsed. Quietly. The second officer stepped slightly away from the first, still holding the documents. He looked at them again, not quickly, not casually, but with intent. His brow furrowed, not in suspicion, but in recognition that something didn't align with the assumptions made earlier. He glanced at the man again. This time, he didn't just see him. He studied him. The posture, the stillness, the way he hadn't tried to control the situation, yet somehow hadn't lost control of himself for a single second. The second officer turned back to the first and spoke softly. So softly that no one nearby could hear the words, but everyone could feel the effect. The first officer's expression changed. Not dramatically, not instantly, but enough. His jaw tightened, his shoulders dropped a fraction. The tone of the moment shifted. He reached out and took the documents back, scanning them again. Slower this time, more carefully, as if the same words might now carry a different meaning. The man waited. No anticipation, no reaction, just patience. The officer cleared his throat and spoke again, but the confidence that once anchored his voice was gone. "Sir," he said, choosing the word carefully, "I just need to confirm something." That single sentence landed heavier than anything said before. Because it wasn't a command. It was a pause. The second officer took one step closer, not toward the man, but toward clarity. He looked at the license one final time, then exhaled slowly. And then he said the name, not loudly, not for effect, quietly, respectfully. Steven Seagal. The sound of traffic seemed to fade. No one moved. The first officer froze, not physically, but internally. You could see it in his eyes. The realization didn't rush in. It settled. The assumptions, the tone, the remarks, the pressure, all of it replayed in a split second. Steven didn't react. No nod, no smile, no satisfaction. He didn't correct them, didn't confirm it. He simply stood there. And that silence, after the name, was unforgettable. Because it wasn't awkward. It was revealing. The first officer straightened immediately, his posture now formal. His voice softened, not out of fear, but out of awareness. "Seer," he said again, this time with measured respect. Steven met his eyes calmly. Not dominant, not submissive. Equal. The people watching felt it. Drivers who had slowed now stopped pretending not to stare. A phone was clearly raised now. No one spoke. No one laughed. No one whispered. The road had become a room full of witnesses. And Steven still said nothing. That was the most powerful part. Because the reveal didn't come with arrogance. It came with restraint. The first officer returned the documents carefully, almost ceremonially. His movements were precise now. Controlled. Professional. The second officer stepped back, giving space. The dynamic had changed completely. Steven finally spoke, but only a few words. Calm even. "Can we finish this?" That was it. No lecture. No reminder of status. No mention of respect. The message was clear without being spoken. This was never about who I am. It was about how you chose to act. The first officer nodded, quickly. Respectfully. "Yes, sir." The words carried weight not because of the name, but because of the moment that came before it. The stop concluded quietly. No ticket, no warning, no announcement. Just professionalism returning where assumption had briefly taken over. Steven got back into his car. The door closed softly. The engine started. And as he pulled away, something lingered behind on the roadside. Not embarrassment. Awareness. Be honest. Do you think the officer learned something in this moment? Typal yarnend or dident. The patrol cars remained still for a moment longer than necessary. The witnesses drove on, carrying the story with them. Because everyone there understood the same thing. The most unforgettable part of that stop wasn't the name. It was the silence that came after it. A silence that exposed assumptions. A silence that corrected power without confrontation. A silence that said everything without raising its voice. What would Liu do in this moment? Stay silent or speak up? Type Silenciers P. The road returned to normal faster than anyone expected. Engines started. Cars moved on. The flashing lights went dark. From the outside, it looked like the moment had passed. But for the people who witnessed it, and especially for the officer who made the wrong call, nothing felt the same. The first officer stood by his patrol car for a few seconds longer than necessary, watching the space where the car had just pulled away. His posture was straight now, professional, controlled. But something behind his eyes had shifted. It wasn't fear, it wasn't embarrassment. It was reflection. Moments like that don't leave bruises. They leave questions. Questions that echo long after the scene is gone. The second officer said nothing. He didn't need to. The lesson had already landed, quietly. Completely. They returned to their cars and drove off, merging back into the flow of traffic like nothing had happened. But the silence they carried with them was heavier than any report they would later write. For the people who witnessed it, drivers, passersby, the woman who had briefly raised her phone, the story traveled quickly. Not exaggerated, not dramatic, just simple. A man was judged by appearance. Authority pushed without cause. Silence revealed the mistake. That's all it took. No shouting, no threats, no power plays, just restraint. And restraint has a way of teaching lessons that force never can. What stood out most wasn't the name that was spoken. It was the behavior that came before it. The calm, the patience, the refusal to react emotionally. That kind of control doesn't come from status. It comes from certainty. And certainty doesn't need to announce itself. The officer learned that power isn't proven by how loudly you speak, or how quickly you assume. It's revealed by how you act when you think no one important is watching. That realization doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives later, in quiet moments, on other stops, in split seconds where judgment tempts impulse. And maybe, just maybe, it changes how the next person is treated. Not because of who they might be, but because of who they are. Steven never told his side of the story. He didn't post about it, didn't explain it. He didn't need to. Because the point was never recognition. The point was restraint. True authority doesn't escalate. It doesn't dominate. It doesn't humiliate. It observes. And when it speaks, it does so carefully. That traffic stop didn't end with applause or consequences written on paper. It ended with something rarer. Perspective. The officer didn't lose his job. He didn't gain a warning. He gained awareness. And awareness, when it's earned the hard way, has the power to reshape decisions for years to come. For viewers watching this story, the lesson lands close to home. Because most of us will never be in that exact situation. But all of us will face moments where we judge before understanding. Moments where we confuse control with confidence. Moments where silence might be wiser than reaction. And the question becomes simple. When the moment tests you, will you rush to prove power, or remain calm enough to reveal it? That day on the roadside didn't change the world, but it changed a moment. And sometimes, that's enough. Final thought. You don't need authority to demand respect, and you don't need a name to command it. Because silence, when carried with confidence, always speaks the loudest.